The smell of motor oil and burnt coffee is something that never quite leaves your skin. It's like a badge of honor for a guy like me. Marcus, a third-generation mechanic who spent his entire life under the hoods of cars that most people gave up on years ago. My grandfather used to say that a car has a soul. You just have to listen for the heartbeat. And for 18 months, my heart was beating right alongside a 1967 Camaro SS that I dragged out of a collapsed barn in the middle of nowhere. It was a rusted-out skeleton, a ghost of American muscle, but I saw something in it that no one else did, and I poured every spare cent, every drop of sweat, and honestly, a good chunk of my sanity into bringing it back to life in my garage at Oak Creek Estates. Now, Oak Creek isn't the kind of place where people usually get their hands dirty. It's a planned community where the lawns look like they've been trimmed with nail scissors, and the HOA president, a woman named Beverly Vance, treats the neighborhood bylaws like they're the Ten Commandments. Beverly is the kind of person who wears expensive yoga gear just to walk to her mailbox and has a smile that's as bright as a strobe light, but twice as cold. And from the day I moved in with my work van and my toolbox, I knew I was the grit in her perfect gears. The explosion happened on a Tuesday evening. I just finished a 12-hour shift at the shop, and all I wanted was to open my garage, sit on my stool with a cold drink, and just admire the way the sunset hit that deep, metallic hugger orange paint I'd spent 4 months perfecting. I hit the remote. The doors started its slow, rhythmic creak upward, and that's when the silence of the suburbs was shattered by a scream so sharp it could have cut glass. Thief! Someone call the police. He's stealing my car. I spun around, still holding my lunch cooler, and saw Beverly charging across the street like a heat-seeking missile. Her iPhone already pressed to her ear, and her face a shade of purple I didn't think was biologically possible. She was hysterical, pointing a manicured finger at my Camaro as it sat innocently in the center of my garage. And before I could even get a word out, she was telling the 911 operator that a suspicious individual was in the process of grand theft auto in broad daylight. I stood there completely stunned, looking at my own keys in my hand, and then back at this woman who was claiming my 18 months of labor was somehow her property, and the sheer audacity of it felt like a physical blow to the chest. Within minutes, the neighborhood was lit up like a Christmas tree with blue and red lights, and 2 patrol cars swerved into my driveway, tires crunching on the gravel I'd just leveled the week before. Beverly was practically vibrating with triumph, shouting at the officers that she'd just bought that exact car from a vintage dealer in Florida for $50,000, and that I must have intercepted the delivery or broken into her property. Officer Miller, a guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, approached me with his hand resting on his holster, his eyes darting between me, the pristine Camaro, and the frantic woman claiming it was hers. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," he said, his voice level but firm, and I felt that old, familiar knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach, knowing how easily a situation like this could go south for a guy who looks like me in a neighborhood like this. But my father didn't in oppos. He just teach me how to rebuild an engine. He taught me that documentation is the only shield a man has against a world that wants to misjudge him. So I didn't in oppos. T argue, I didn't in oppos. T raised my voice. I just reached for the thick black 3-ring binder sitting on my workbench. "Officer, I'm going to reach for this folder very slowly," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "And inside, you're going to find every single receipt, every progress photo, and the original bill of sale from the widow who sold me this car when it was nothing but a pile of orange rust." Beverly's face went from purple to a ghostly white as I started flipping through the pages, showing the time-stamped photos of the frame-off restoration, the serial numbers on the new engine block, and finally, the title that had been in my name for over a year. Miller took the binder, his eyebrows climbing higher with every page he turned, while his partner, a younger guy, leaned over to get a look at the engine bay, his whistle of admiration cutting through Beverly's stuttering attempts to explain that there must be some mistake. "Ma'am," Miller said, turning to Beverly with a look of pure exhaustion, "this man has more documentation for this car than I have for my own children. Do you have a bill of sale? A wire transfer? Anything at all?" Beverly started fumbling with her phone, claiming the dealer must have scammed her, that the paperwork was in the mail, but the damage was done, and as the officer started taking a report for a false police call, I saw something in her eyes that chilled me more than the initial scream. It wasn't Apo's embarrassment. It was a cold, calculating rage that told me this was only the beginning of a very long war. The following Monday, the first gift from Beverly arrived in my mailbox. A formal notice of violation from the HOA claiming that my Ford Transit work van was an unauthorized commercial vehicle and that I had 48 hours to remove it or face a $200 daily fine. It was signed with Beverly's signature, a flourish of ink that felt like a slap in the face, but she didn't realize that I'd spent my lunch breaks reading the Oak Creek bylaws like they were a manual for a classic Chevy. I knew for a fact that the commercial vehicle ban was enacted in 2021, and since I'd moved in back in 2019, my van was legally grandfathered in, but Beverly didn't and Apo's care about the law. She cared about the optics of her kingdom. I'd see her during her morning and power walks and stopping at the edge of my driveway with a clipboard, squinting at my grass, as if she could hear it growing past the 2-inch limit, and I realized she wasn't Apo's. Just a nosy neighbor. She was a predator who used the HOA as her private hunting ground. That's when I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start building a fortress. So I spent a weekend installing 4 high-definition 4K security cameras that covered every square inch of my property, hidden discreetly under the eaves of the roof. If Beverly wanted to watch me, she was going to have to deal with me watching her right back. And it didn't in Apo's take long for the cameras to catch something that made my blood run cold. Around 3 a.m. on a Thursday, the motion sensor triggered an alert on my phone, and when I opened the app, I saw a figure in a dark hoodie crouching by my driveway, their hand moving in a rhythmic motion as they scattered something across the dark asphalt. I ran outside with a flashlight, but they were already gone, vanishing into the shadows of the manicured hedges. And when I looked down, my light reflected off dozens of sharp, galvanized roofing nails, perfectly placed to puncture the tires of my Camaro if I'd backed out that morning. I didn't in Apo's. Called the police right away. I knew I needed more. I needed to understand why a woman with $1 million house and a white BMW was so obsessed with destroying a mechanic's life. So I reached out to a few of the outcasts in the neighborhood. I met up with Elias, a retired accountant who'd been fined $5,000 for a mailbox font that was too modern and Sarah, a single mom who'd been forced to sell her house after the HOA buried her in litigation over a swing set. We sat in Elias's dimly lit kitchen, and as we compared notes, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. Beverly wasn't an Apo's. Just a Karen With a power trip, she was running a sophisticated racket. She would target homeowners who didn't and Apo's. Have the resources to fight back, bury them in fines, and then, through a private real estate firm, swoop into help them sell their distressed properties to investors for a fraction of their value, all while taking a massive commission on both ends. But the real holy grail came when Sarah handed me a folder she'd been sitting on for months, a collection of HOA financial statements she'd managed to get during a brief stint as the board secretary before Beverly had her ousted. As I stayed up until the sun rose, tracing the flow of money, I found it. The Oak Creek Beautification Fund, which had paid out nearly $90,000 over the last 2 years to a company called, Vance and Amp, Associates Consulting, A quick search of the state's business registry confirmed my suspicion. The company was registered to Beverly's maiden name and shared the same P.O. box as her personal bank account. She wasn't an Apo's. Just a bully. She was a thief, systematically looting the neighborhood's reserve funds to pay for her own lifestyle, while her own home was secretly slipping into a pre-foreclosure status due to a mountain of credit card debt and unpaid back taxes. The tension in the air was so thick you could feel it on your skin as the night of the annual HOA board meeting arrived, a night Beverly clearly expected to be a victory lap, where she would announce a new automotive maintenance ban that would effectively outlaw me from even opening my garage door. The community center was packed, the air conditioning humming against the nervous chatter of neighbors who were tired of living under a microscope, and there was Beverly, sitting at the front table like a queen on her throne, her hair perfect and her gavel ready. She started her presentation with a slideshow about, property values, and community standards, end quote. Her voice dripping with that fake, sugary concern, and when she finally pointed to a photo of my house, calling it an, end quote, industrial eyesore, end quote, I knew it was time to pull the pin on the grenade I'd been holding. I stood up, not with a shout, but with a calm that seemed to unsettle her more than any anger would have, and I held up a tablet connected to the room's projector system. Beverly, before we talk about my garage, maybe we should talk about 2:33 a.m. last Tuesday, I said, and before she could object, I hit play on a video that showed her, clear as day in infrared 4K, dumping a bag of roofing nails onto my driveway. A collective gasp went up from the room, a sound like a giant intake of breath, and Beverly's face went a shade of gray that matched the asphalt in the video, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But I wasn't oppos. Done. I flipped to the next slide, a spreadsheet showing the $90,000 she'd funneled in Advance and AMP, Associates, and I watched as the, end quote, Queen, end quote, finally realized that her throne was made of glass and it was currently shattering in front of everyone she'd ever looked down on. The room erupted into absolute chaos. People who had been quiet for years were suddenly on their feet, shouting for an audit, shouting for her resignation, and in the middle of it all, 2 detectives from the Financial Crimes Unit, whom I'd called that afternoon, stepped through the back doors. Beverly tried to run. She actually tried to shove past Sarah to get to the side exit, but there was nowhere left to hide, and as they led her out in handcuffs, the very same silver bracelets she tried to put on me, the silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. It's been 6 months since that night, and the neighborhood feels different now. The fences are still there, but the barriers are gone, and we've spent the last few months dismantling the, end quote, Vance regime, end quote, and returning the stolen funds to the families who were cheated out of their homes. I still spend my Saturday mornings in the garage. The Camaro is finished now, and it runs like a dream, a roar of pure American defiance that echoes through a community that finally feels like home. But sometimes I look across the street at Beverly's old house, which is now being renovated by a nice young couple with a messy dog and a loud lawnmower. And I wonder if people like Beverly ever really change, or if they're just waiting for a new neighborhood to ruin. My dad was right. A car has a soul, and maybe a neighborhood does too. It just takes someone willing to look under the hood and do the dirty work to keep it running right. But what do you think? Was I too hard on her? Or is this just the kind of justice that every HOA bully deserves? Have you ever had a neighbor who tried to weaponize the rules against you? And did you find a way to fight back? Or did you just pack up and leave? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, I think we've all dealt with a Beverly Vance at some point in our lives, and the world might be a better place if we all started keeping a 3-ring binder of our own.